five other canyons in the eastern Sierra. In the summer, it's hot. In the winter, it's cold. And except for the occasional thunder shower, not much happens here. But that hasn't always been the case. In the early 1900s, Sand Canyon was the center of activity. It was a crucial link in one of the 20th century's most difficult engineering feats, construction of the Los Angeles Aqueduct.
My dad came up in 1908 and soon was working in Sand Canyon, which was the biggest project in the building the aqueduct. Was the siphon in Sand Canyon. It was the deepest siphon.
The aqueduct brought water from the Owens River, 233 miles south to Los Angeles, from an elevation of 4,000 feet to just above sea level, all by the power of gravity alone.
They say the aqueduct can be likened to a long garden hose reaching from the intake up above Independence to the Cascades down at San Fernando. And if you lay a garden hose down, the water would all flow by gravity, but the canyons were a problem. They had to keep it up on the side of the hill in order to push it over the Red Rock Canyon summit.
To get the water through Sand Canyon, Chief Engineer William Mulholland first tried to tunnel through the north and south slopes of the canyon.
Instead of laying steel pipe down through the canyon and back up the other side, they in Sand Canyon they drilled shafts and plastered it with concrete and put reinforcing steel in, and they called them pressure tunnels, one on each hillside, far into the hill, and then at the bottom why they connected with a straight steel pipe. That's the 10-foot aqueduct pipe, which they imported from Germany. That's the only people that could make that pipe at the time. And so they were all set up until they were going to have the inaugural address and all the festivities in Los Angeles and show them the water. And when they filled that section in Sand Canyon, they were already at the site in Los Angeles, and they got a phone call that there's a disaster in Sand Canyon. It's leaking all over the place.
Neither Mulholland nor his chief assistant, Harvey Van Norman, were engineers by trade.
They both had grade school educations. Mulholland had a grade school education, and Van Norman didn't complete grammar school. But they did study hydraulics, but not well enough. They didn't know the terrible power of high-pressure water. They stopped and concentrated on Sand Canyon and filled it slowly up to level, and when they got it up to level, why, it just blew sky high and blew a great big hole in the north wall of the canyon. And when I was 4 or 5 years old, I remember going up there and looking into that hole. You can still look into the hole, but it's nothing like it used to be. It's been filled in. There is a gate there, a peephole, where you can look where the steel pipe came out. And it's a tunnel that runs straight back in the mountain and meets the pressure tunnels, they called them, the shafts that they dug. The steel pipe was a straight pipe, 550 feet long, across the canyon and into both sides to meet the tunnels, the shafts. And under pressure, that pipe buckled It laid in cradles about 50 feet below the present cradles. It laid in those cradles, and you'll notice that the upstream half of the cradle is broken out. That pipe buckled so that it pushed itself out through those cradles and broke those upstream side off. And it was all kinds of ruined steel pipe there.
The pressure tunnel idea was abandoned in favor of the steel pipe siphon that we see today. Water can be pushed through the pipe as long as the elevation of the water leaving the canyon is the same or lower than the elevation of the water entering the canyon. All told, 100,000 men and women worked on the aqueduct. After 5 years of political, legal, and financial battles, after disease, worker strikes, and sabotage, and after monumental engineering accomplishment, the job got done. The Big Ditch, as it was often called, actually consisted of a series of open canals, reservoirs, steel pipe, concrete-covered conduits, and giant siphons like the one in Sand Canyon. When it was completed in 1913, it was the longest aqueduct in the Western Hemisphere. Once it was finished, patrolmen were stationed up and down the aqueduct to inspect it and protect it. 2 of these men and their families were stationed at Sand Canyon. And this is where our story begins. Jess Ramsey was assistant patrolman at Sand Canyon from 1933 to 1938. When he arrived here with his family, his son Bob was 15 and his daughter Lois was 19.
He had to what we call ride ditch. And he did it on horseback, 8 miles one way, 11 miles the other, and he'd trade off. He had 2 horses assigned to him, and there was another patrolman in the canyon that had 2 horses. So there was a big corral with 4 horses and a cow, and that was to guard the aqueduct from any thievery or bombing or anything like that might go on. Also leaks, and that was and then he was to be on duty in case of an emergency. He was on duty 24 hours a day.
Down canyon from the Ramsey house, nestled in shade trees, was patrolman Dave Shelton's house.
The other patrolman was Dave Shelton with his wife and 2 children, and he was I would say he was the head patrolman because he was senior patrolman, and but they both had the same duties. One day, one would patrol north, and the other would go south, and then they'd switch. And they each had 2 horses, and this is the way they operated.
When Oscar Kroll was assigned the job of head patrolman at Sand Canyon in 1942, his daughter Litha was 10 years old.
My dad was the patrolman for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and it was his job to patrol the aqueduct from an area that they call Boulder Peak, which is, about 5 miles north of here, to the end of Short Canyon, which is south of here. And he made the patrol every day. He was looking for leaks, indication of moisture where there shouldn't be. Then they would know that there was a crack there or that something was going to happen, and they would try to repair it before it became a break. The other part of his job, one part was that at least once a year, generally in October, they had what they call a shut-off, and they shut the water off of the Haywee reservoir, and then all of the patrolmen would walk inside the aqueduct, not the siphons, but the tunnels part, and they'd walk in pairs of 2, and they would walk, I don't know how many miles, but then they would take that 2 out and put another 2 in, and they'd walk a while. And they did this all the way from Haywee down to Fairmont Reservoir, which is down by Lancaster. And the men were looking to see where there needed to be repair work done, where there were cracks or
From the inside.
from the inside. Well, another part of my dad's job was that either once or twice a month, either the 1st or the 15th, I think, he had to take measurements of the water level. And the manholes, which are big enough for the men to go down into the aqueduct, and they have the rungs locked down, these are locked with big padlocks. And he would have to lean over those and with a measuring device measure how low the water was from that point. And he had to do that at each of the manholes. And then there's these other small holes. You just lift the metal thing out of it, and then you look down there and you take the measurement there.
During World War II, specially trained guards were hired, and guard shacks were built.
The guards were hired to guard the aqueduct against sabotage or somebody trying to damage the aqueduct. They were all issued guns, including my father.
Barracks were built in Sand Canyon to house some of the guards.
There were 3 small dormitory-type buildings that were on a north-south orientation. And there was one that was on an east-west orientation.
The Ramseys home in Sand Canyon had few of the conveniences we take for granted today.
So we came to a house with no running hot water, no electricity, no appliances, no conveniences whatsoever. My mother took the attitude that you took what was handed to you and you did it in good spirit.
The Ramseys learned to appreciate the simple pleasures of Sand Canyon.
The house was completely shaded, it was a beautiful place, and especially in the hot summertime. And in the evening, we always had a breeze here, and it was really quite comfortable actually. And I would have my bed out here in the corner of the lot, and I slept out every night. Well, this mountain right here to my left, I would climb up as high as I could climb and find the biggest boulder that I could dig underneath to dislodge it. And once I got it teetering, I could get behind it and give it a shove, and it would roll down that mountain big time. And when it hit the bottom, it would just jump right over that creek bed over there. So even though there wasn't a lot of recreation, that was one way of having fun. And when my cousins came and other kids that were with me, well, that was one of the things that we'd do.
Well, we had a nice bathroom with a full-size tub, and a toilet with a tank up at the ceiling that you pulled the chain. And we had lots of water with lots of pressure from the aqueduct. We did have a telephone, and it was the crank kind. Our ring was 2 shorts and a long, and we could talk to people up and down the aqueduct. We had a radio that we could get Salt Lake City after 10 o'clock at night.
We had Coleman lanterns, with the mantles, the cloth mantles they put in, and that was our main source of lighting. This is where the garage was located, and it was a small garage, just a single-car garage. And one of the things that remind me of this garage so vividly is the fact that my dad and I were cleaning it out one day, and he had a rake, and he was in raking, and I was carrying out the debris. As I took out the debris and came back, as I came around the corner of the garage, he found a big red racer in the garage and had it on the rake, and he threw it out the front and hit me right in the face and went around my neck and went down and onto the ground. Well, naturally, I was froze right there. And I think rattlesnake, that's all I could think of. But when I looked down, it was a red racer. Now, I was going to say, well, it seemed to me like it was that big. It could have been only that big. But that was one of the stories that reminds me of this garage.
This little rock wall, I don't remember, but you do, don't you, Bob?
Yes, that was part of the rock wall that went alongside of the house.
And I'm not sure if our dad built this rock wall or not, but he did build these 2 items. The first one holds the desert cooler, and the second one held the Oya.
Well, the desert cooler was a wooden frame built like a refrigerator, covered with screening and burlap sack, and it had a piping around the top of it on the edges, and the water dripped down on the burlap and soaked it up real good. And as the breeze blew, especially during the afternoon and night, that would keep everything nice and fresh and cool inside. And we kept, we had butter and milk and eggs and things that we kept in that desert cooler, and surprisingly, it worked real good.
Beside the desert cooler that we had sitting out behind the house, we had this Oya, which was just a big jug made of terracotta, and it was porous material so that the air would cool that water. And my dad had made a cement base for that, as he did the desert cooler. And that was where we got our cool drinking water. That was the coolest thing we had to drink.
In the 1930s, head patrolman Dave Sheltrin built a swimming pool in his yard for the residents of Sand Canyon to enjoy.
So he built this swimming pool, and both families used it. And you can see that it's very crude, but it's the best we had, This was like being in heaven.
Our cousins got in a lot. I remember that.
Yeah, when we had friends and cousins that came and relatives, we'd come down and cool off,
What was the water temperature like?
Cold, because it came out of this siphon, and that water was pretty cool. Even in the summertime, the water was real cool, so it was refreshing.
The pool was also used by the Krolls in the 1940s.
And I went swimming at least every day during the summer, sometimes twice a day. The diving board was down there. The pipe where the water came in was right here. And because we didn't have any chemicals like they have today to keep the pool clean, and of course it has no filter or anything, we had to drain the water and clean the pool, get the algae out, about every 4 or 5 days. We just used a nozzle on a hose and squirted down through in between all the rocks. It was really cold the first day you refilled it because the water comes straight out of the aqueduct. But the sun warmed it up in 2 or 3 days, so about the time it was ready to be cleaned again, it was nice and warm.
Unlike the Ramsey house, Head Patrolman Quoll's residence had a limited amount of electricity.
We had enough pressure to power a small generator that was powered by the water, and it generated enough electricity to give us lights at night and to be able to heat and iron, to iron our clothes, although you could not do both at the same time. So you had to do all your ironing in the daytime. The electricity you have in the house nowadays is what they call alternating current. This was such a small generator, it generated direct current. So for a radio, we had to have a special radio that could be run on direct current, which I don't know if they even have those nowadays.
Part of the head patrolman's job was to maintain an attractive yard.
And it was part of my father's job to keep the yards looking nice. And the Department of Water and Power made a showplace of these stations. And of course, we had all the water we needed. And they had, the Department of Water and Power had a gardener that would come up and help my father with telling him how to prune the roses and how to take care of the yard. There was a planting area all across the front of the lawn and a planting area along the driveway. Then there was a lawn that was probably about 30 feet even from the front of the yard to the sidewalk at the house. Then there were rose bushes right next to the house. The house was made of cement. It had walls about 12 inches, 18 inches wide. That was to make the house stay cooler in the summertime. At the back, there was an enclosed back porch that had a wood stove that we used for cooking. There was a large gas tank, maybe about 500 gallons, that sat about where that rock is. And I guess under the ground there was a pipe that came onto this wall here. And this was about 4 feet deep, and there were steps going down into it. And at the end of the pipe there was a device that you opened and let the gas come out of the pipe. And my father would put a 5-gallon gas can underneath that and fill up the gas can, and then walk back out and then pour the gas into his city pickup. And as I said before, we lived here during the Second World War, and gasoline was rationed, and it was also in short supply, so that was kept locked, the device that allowed you to get the gas out. Over here is the chimney. You can see that it's made of cement, and see how thick it was. And here's the little bits of the reinforcing rod. And here's another section of it and some more reinforcing rod. And I guess the rest of the house is underneath the sagebrush there.
Well, the big thing about the aqueduct was that it brought the railroad. It connected, it gave rail service all the way from Los Angeles to the main line up at Mina, Nevada. And having the railroad, they had to have sidings to discharge these huge steel pipes from Germany. And the one that served Sand Canyon was Brown, named for George Brown, who was a rancher up in Owens Valley.
With the aqueduct came the railroad. With the railroad came workers. And with the workers came homesteaders.
My dad was one of the first homesteaders. He filed for his homestead in 1909. The aqueduct brought people in, and and all the people saw the valley and figured that the water was being piped down the hill. We'd have water here, and the whole valley was homesteaded. I have a homesteader map with all the names on, and a lot of them joined the Inyo Kern Land and Water Company. My dad was one of them. He was a stockholder in the Inyo Kern Land and Water Company. But Brown became a real lively town. They said it had 3,000 inhabitants at one time. Brown was noted as a city of characters, or a town filled with characters. One of them was the Wortley brothers, and Kenneth Wortley wrote a book, and he describes all of these different characters. They were all centered in Brown. This hotel was the social center of at least the North Valley, more or less the whole valley, in my day. And they had a big heating stove in there. In the evenings, they'd fire that up, and they had couches all the way around it, and it was like a conversation pit. And I was just a little tad that I'd wedge myself in the corner, so I'd hear a lot of these stories firsthand that Wortley talks about. It was a pretty lively place. In fact, the aqueduct finally shut down the saloon at Brown as being too disruptive to the crews, and made them move, and they moved the saloon to Leelighter. When homesteaders with children started coming, they needed a school, and my dad and a partner, and he had his contractor's license. His partner and my dad fitted up this saloon for a school, the first school in the valley. Brown had a railroad section crew to maintain the tracks, and the section foreman was Earl Standard. They had a school, and the teacher was Earl Standard's wife, Tiny Standard, Ethel Mary Standard.
When I moved here, I was in the 5th grade, and I went to school at Brown, which is 4 miles from here. It's what's known as a one-room schoolhouse, but actually it had 4 rooms, I guess. There was the schoolroom, and then there was a dining room library combination. There was a kitchen, and there was a shop room, I guess you'd say. And the teacher was Ethel Mary Standard, and she is quite well known here in the valley. She was the only teacher at Brown.
She was like a breath of fresh air wherever she went. She was very knowledgeable. She's graduated from a woman's teaching college, but I was lucky and privileged to attend one of her festivity, one of her programs.
She presented a play that she had written called Return of the Wildflowers. She made the costumes out of cheesecloth. There wasn't much sewing to it, but she made it on you while you were standing up.
Tiny Standard gave me, I say, the first haircut that I ever got without a bowl. She wanted to cut my hair, so I sat still, and she cut my hair, and I guess best I ever looked.
In October of 1945, a large cloudburst hit Sand Canyon.
We heard this roaring sound, and my dad realized what it was. It was the water coming down the creek.
It rained for 2 days and devastated Sand Canyon, very much like a similar storm in the early 1920s.
I was eyewitness to one flood, and it was around 1922 or 23. And the first thing I saw was dust, and the next thing I noticed was a roar of sound, like, I don't know, there's nothing to compare it with. It's just an immense roar. And here was a river running through the desert. is about, I'll probably exaggerate, a quarter of a mile wide, at least 200 yards wide. And they're just trees and logs and sagebrush, and it's all muddy, traveling faster than you could run, and about 6 or 8 feet deep, running toward China Lake. So I know what it looks like 6 miles away, but Joe Lacey describes it up on the alluvial fan.
In the February 1923 issue of Popular Science magazine, Joe Lacey described the event. He was an aqueduct guard at the time. His cabin was at the mouth of Sand Canyon.
My first concern, of course, was for the pipe siphon of the aqueduct that crossed the head of Sand Canyon. As soon as I was certain that the water wasn't creeping any higher, I found that the top of the huge pipe, 26 feet above the floor of the canyon, was covered with water to a depth of more than 7 feet. Although battered, the aqueduct was safe. At midnight, the water was going out of the canyon at a rate of 2,500 cubic feet per second. Joe Lacey, aqueduct guard.
Mud and debris was deposited on the valley floor in a fan-shaped mass, 20 feet deep in spots and 15 miles wide.
And this is the garage. Before the flood, it was big enough for 3 cars, for a 3-car garage. And when the flood came, it washed the garage, and the roof of the garage ended up down against the gate posts there down at the gate. So our car ended up against the pillar of the siphon, and my bicycle ended up against the cottonwood tree that's down across from the tunnel.
5 months after the cloudburst hit, the area was rocked by a major earthquake.
And on the morning of the earthquake, I was out of my bed and dressed and out towards this gate, and the ground was still shaking. My mother was with me. And the reason we were going out this gate is because the rocks were rolling from up there on the hill. And I thought we could go over to the other side and would be safer, but my dad was standing on the lawn and hollering at us to stop because he realized that the rocks were also rolling from that side. Sometime later, after the earthquake, we saw this rock that had fallen coming down the mountain here. So it was a good thing that my father told us to stop running this way.
Sand Canyon. It's like a lot of other canyons in the eastern Sierra. Not much happens here. But a few things remain to remind us of the people who used to live and work here. It was an experience that helped shape their lives and one that they will never forget.
I felt that living in this canyon was a very positive, rewarding, growing experience.
It was kind of lonely at first, you know. We had to get used to that. But after that, there was many things that we could do.
The fact that I didn't have any playmates or anybody to play with in the canyon. I became an avid reader, and by the time I got into high school, I was an honor student.
And I think it's helped me all during my life.